Hello and welcome to this new episode of the long-term deep reading project on Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain. Today we're going to talk about the third section of chapter 6. As usual, I'm going to structure my video in a couple of chapters. So today there are 5 of them. The first one, a bit of news about Hans. Second chapter, news about Naphta. Then the third chapter, we are diving into the long discussion between Settembrini and Naphta. Number 4, a bit of a background information about the specific situation of the Jesuit order in Germany to better understand Hans' reactions to this biographical information about Naphta's background. And number 5, sort of an outlook. Okay, let's start with the first part, some news about Hans. So what do we learn about Hans in this section of chapter number 6? We learn that Hans has now been at the Berghof for a year, a round year, as it is called in the text, probably to emphasize once again the idea of the cyclical nature of time that was introduced earlier in this 6th chapter. And it is also fitting that also a kind of circular movement is described in terms of location. Hans regularly turns to a special location, a location that has been where it had played a crucial role during his first days of his stay at the Berghof. This bench in this thoroughly idyllic landscape where he had fainted, where he had this strong nosebleed and this dreamlike memories of his schoolmate Přibislav Hippe. But now he is he is returning to this place regularly, and now he's able to approach this place by a completely different route. So here too, a sort of cyclical movement is described as sort of a circle is completed in 2 ways. Once it is, on one hand, it is a return to the place of the daydream, to the place, one could almost say the place of revelation, but it is a return by a different route, so by a different semicircle. And what else do we learn here? We learn that there is a further reference to what has already been hinted at several times, but never explicitly stated, namely that there actually was a night of love between Hans and Claudia Shosha. At this time, the narrator becomes unusually clear and explicit. It is described how Hans looks at this X-ray image of Claudia, how he looks at, and I quote from the text, looks at the flesh which once in Carnival Week Hans Castorp had so madly tasted. So this is not the way to write about a harmless, flirtatious conversation. This is about how one writes about the real thing, the act of love, or at least how people have written about this 100 years ago in this strange and morally inhibited way of the late 19th, early 20th century. And again, further support this erotic subtext, the flower of Columbine or Aquilegia is mentioned several times in this first part of this section of chapter 6. And I already pointed out in an earlier video talking about all the botanical references and the symbolism, the symbolic meaning of quite a number of flowers, that this flower, a Columbine or a Aquilegia, that this usually symbolizes this is a symbol of seduction, of carnal love, of the sexual energy of man. So it makes a lot of sense that this Aquilegia or Columbine is mentioned here a couple of times. And we notice that Hans is anything but at peace with himself. He is still searching for his own ideological standpoint. He calls to mind the images of the 2 grandfathers that have been described earlier, grandfather Castorp, his own grandfather, and grandfather Settembrini, and the 2 of them who, despite their outward similarity in wearing black clothes, they could hardly be more different from each other at the inside. And he thinks about what, about the different ideologies these 2 grandfathers represent. And he also ponders about all these opposing worldviews that on the one hand his mentor Settembrini and on the other hand the psychoanalyst Dr. Krokowski are offering him, the very different ways that they try to explain the world to him. And so he ponders all this, and he seems to be still rather perplexed by all the opposing positions that you can think of on such vast problems as form and freedom, body and spirit, honor and shame, time and eternity. And I find the smug undertone with which the narrator describes Hans' pondering, I find this smug undertone very interesting. It becomes clear to me that the narrator doesn't really take seriously any of this amateurish, half-hearted musings by Hans. He compares it to a harmless, childish game that Hans used to play in his childhood days when he himself described his childish way of daydreaming as taking stock. And so when the narrator describes that even now Hans is in a somewhat childish way trying to adopt sort of a dignified grandfatherly expression, where he also in this childish way even tries to imitate the stiff way the grandfather is holding up his chin and in this upright position. So a sort of pathetic pomposity on Hans' side. So this childish daydreamer Hans now comes to witness the intellectual games and skirmishes of two really big boys. He now becomes witness how these two dyed-in-the-wool disputants, Settembrini and Naphta, engage in their ideological battles. Okay, but before we take a closer look at the content of the next argument between Settembrini and Naphta, let's take a look at what we learn about Naphta here. I would like to summarize the impression that this description of Naphta's living environment makes on me. So in the previous section, the outward appearance of Naphta had already been described in quite unflattering terms, like as Naphta being corrosively ugly, and also his room at the as a subtenant at the build house of the tailor Lukacek is not likely to improve the overall aesthetic impression. Everything that is described here, the furniture, etc., that points to a terribly repulsive mix of styles, really a first-class aberration of taste. So there are Baroque easy chairs mentioned. So in front of my inner eyes, I see the very chunky, ostentatious things made of dark wood and plus these plush cushions. And you can also almost see the tassels and fringes on the furniture, plus wine red silk. So everything gives the impression of abundance of money, but really a lack of taste. And then Naphta himself, he dresses it all up by saying all works of art whose function is to express the soul and the emotions, they're always so ugly as to be beautiful and so beautiful as to be ugly. So of course, this saying is particularly meant to describe the wooden sculpture in the room, which seems to be a prime example of ugliness, but you can also extend this statement to the whole interior design and the furniture and to Naphta himself. So so what is the sculpture? It's a so-called Pietà, so that is an image of the Holy Mary mourning her dead son Jesus, and a very common subject in medieval art. So there are numerous paintings and sculptures on this, and some of them are really can be considered highlights of European art. Above all, I think the so-called Roman Pietà made by Michelangelo, made out of a single monolithic block of marble, and Michelangelo was only 23 or 24 years old. So this is at St. Peter's in Rome. So, but this really pieces of art that are of an extraordinary beauty. But the sculpture here in Naphta's room is probably modeled on the so-called Pietà of Röntgen. I provide you with a picture of this very specific type of Pietà. So, what does it say about someone's state of mind if if they place such a sculpture in their living room or in their study room to embellish the ambience? So that's really strange. So okay, so the discussion about this sculpture also then is further sparked by Settembrini, who joins the small group, and yeah, then the following argument between Settembrini and Naphta in this section is not quite as clearly structured as in the previous chapter. Um, I think you can tell that both of them are more interested in arguing for the sake of arguing. But what I think I should like to try to bring a bit of order and structure into the discussion. So let's move on to chapter 3 of this video, the discussion. And again, this is a discussion. I think I try to break it down into 3 parts. Part number 1 is the conflict between spirit and nature. Naphta is a great advocate of the position that the mind or the spirit must emancipate itself from nature. And that's not surprising. Naphta already positioned himself in the previous discussion as a great advocate of dualism, of this worldview that sees the world divided into 2 competing principles or opposing principles. So he also, on every topic, he likes to differentiate between 2 different opposing forces. He likes to this process of always distinguishing, splitting, separating, emphasizing opposites. So that's his main credo as a dualist. And this is why the emphasis of the difference is also so important for him when it comes to the question of spirit and nature. And for him, they are not just completely distinct, so there's also a sort of a hierarchy between them. So for him, clearly the spirit is of a higher value. On the other hand, Settembrini, as a monist, so more or less emphasizing that behind everything there's a unifying principle, Settembrini, of course, he immediately intervenes here. For him, such a division is an unacceptable, hostile attitude towards nature. To Settembrini, neglecting or disrespecting nature and also the material part of nature is absurd and inhuman. And then this is some of the rare events when also Hans tries to join in the debate. And he's joining not with a clear position, um, but rather with a question that could also be understood as an attempt to even challenge his mentor Settembrini. In a nutshell, what Hans is doing here is his argument is as follows. How should we deal then with all these senseless monstrosities that nature commits, somewhat of which are also hostile to life, to human nature? Natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, epidemics, volcanoes. Aren't these really arguments for Naphta's view that nature is the lowly, senseless thing against which the spirit must rise up or even rebel? And here, Settembrini, he is not rejecting this outwardly. He is really taking seriously his role as a mentor, as a benevolent mentor. He makes an important distinction. He says, okay, yes, you may have a point here. Some kind of revolt of the spirit against nature could be justified, but it really depends on the objective with which the spirit, or rather the intellect, turns against nature. If it is done with the objective of preserving and maintaining human dignity, then it is commendable according to Settembrini. But if this is done with the aim to humiliate, to oppress humanity, to oppress the natural part of the human nature, then this is condemnable, because this kind of hostility to nature is an attitude that leads to the sword and the stake, so to atrocity and to misanthropic cruelties. And then this mentioning of the sword and the stake, this is another opportunity for Naphta to react immediately by strongly opposing Settembrini's viewpoint. For Naphta, the fact that something leads to the sword and to the stake, this is not a bad thing for him in per se. He is now splitting hairs again. For him, no, he says, no, not every kind of terror and violence against people and against humans is bad. Uh, terror that terror that is just a collateral effect of the scientific principle, that might be bad, but a terror that takes place in the service of a supposed good, this is a justified type of terror, according to Naphta, even if there's such collateral damage as the destruction of human body. So as long as the terror is aiming at a higher means, for example, at the spiritual salvation of the soul, it can be justified according to Naphta. It's praiseworthy and commendable according to him. So all the atrocities of the Inquisition for Naphta have been fine, because the main objective had been the salvation of the soul. And okay, so this of course is a red rag for the humanist Settembrini. And so Settembrini denounces this attitude as what he calls voluntarism. So voluntarism is a term that is frequently used in several disciplines, but so what is meant here is the way that this is used in the field of religious philosophy. And in the religious philosophy terminology, this is the correct label or term for an attitude that always gives the divine will priority over human standards, including the standards of rationality and intellect and humanity. And so then a large part of the discussion revolves around this question. So what has moral priority or superiority? Is it a supposed divine will, or what any individual self-proclaimed theological leaders might declare to be the divine will, the will of God? Or is it what the human mind, the human intellect and rationalism recognize as the right thing to do? So what should have moral priority? So this is at the core of the discussion that follows between Settembrini and Naphta. And it's sometimes difficult to detect this underlying main topic, because Naphta and Settembrini, they like to throw around big names such as the Copernican and the Ptolemaic worldview. So that is whether the Earth or the Sun is at the center of our little niche of the universe. And when they talk about the Church Father Augustine and his quote, "I believe so that I may know," and etc. But in essence, it is always about the same question. So what is the right thing to do? Blind submission to a so-called divine will, whatever that might be, or an orientation towards what the human mind recognizes as the right thing to do, also in the moral sense. So, and Settembrini is, of course, a strong advocate of the human mind, and Naphta vehemently disagrees. For Naphta, there is no such thing as a search for truth guided solely by the human mind and by human rationality and without any presuppositions. And so the key sentences to understand Naphta's position so are the following quotes. There is no such thing as pure knowledge. Faith is the organ of knowledge, and the intellect is secondary. There is no pure truth. What is true is what is morally helpful to man. So for Naphta, any unconditional pursuit of knowledge is not only pointless and misleading, it should even be declared, according to him, a sort of criminal offense. So Naphta thus reveals himself as a person primarily driven by ideology. For him, there is no such thing as an independent and free reasoning. So there always has to be a pre-existing philosophical standpoint, a specific worldview or ideology that must be pre-existent and that must control the pursuit of knowledge. The ideology must ultimately even predetermine the result of all attempts to generate knowledge. So that's Naphta's viewpoint. And to underpin his point of view, he then comes up with a rhetorically cleverly devised bogus alternative. So I think this is a classical rhetorical trick of ideology-driven rhetoricians. This artificially narrowing down the field of the vast field of possibilities to just two possibilities, just two options, one of which is described in such an absurd and extreme way that only the other one's own pet alternative seems to be the only acceptable and reasonable one. So, and Naphta is doing this, is playing this game in a clever way. But this is a concept used by ideology-driven people all over the world at every time. You can see this in today's politics as well. But Naphta's bogus alternatives are the following. Either Ptolemy is right, and then the world is dualistic, and then God is outside the world. In which case, the main problem we have to deal with is to the reconciliation of the world with God, the salvation of the soul, the reconciliation with God, and thus all other individual or social issues are at best secondary, but mostly they are irrelevant. or the alternative, it's that maybe the heliocentric Copernican worldview is correct, then the world is monistic, then all human endeavor revolves solely around questions of social organization and the subordination of the individual and its will to the common interest, to the state. So then we end up with a human society that is similar to an ants colony. Of course, these are not the only two conceivable and possible worldviews. There's a huge number of alternatives, but Naphta is narrowing it down artificially to these two opposing options. But Settembrini is a clever guy. He immediately recognized this, that this is a false play, and he identifies Naphta's rhetorical attempt as a false alternative between medieval Gothic thinking on the one hand and Prussian state totalitarianism on the other hand. And he says that no, these are not the true alternatives. So there are other options. For example, the Renaissance, it saw the rise of the heliocentric worldview, but it was not a phase in which the state was idolized. On the contrary, the state was supposed to serve and protect the freedom of the individual. So even in the Renaissance, when the heliocentric worldview emerged, personality, human rights, and individual freedom were the central values. But by using the word freedom, Settembrini really triggers a rant by Naphta. So this is again the moving on to the second big part of this discussion. So freedom or terror. So for Naphta, freedom is a red rag. For him, the predetermined ideology is the supreme measure of all things. So there is no freedom for an individual freedom, because it's the predetermined ideology that dominates and determines everything. And that is why it's precisely at this point of the discussion that he bursts out with his strange vision of human society, where he's talking about the principal values are, I quote, absolute mandate, the iron bond, discipline, sacrifice, the renunciation of the ego, the curbing of the personality. So what the individual needs and wrestles after, and what it will be create, is not freedom, but terror. So he is a clear proponent of this form of state terror driven by an ideology. So now the bad word has been spoken, terror. And now it's just a matter of luring Naphta into explaining the specific ideology that, according to him, should be the measure of all things. So who sets the rules of terror? But before he lets the cat out of the bag, Naphta interestingly tries to re-establish some common ground with Settembrini. And for me, this is one of the most unclear points in this chapter. I do not fully understand what is his motivation for doing this, because actually looking for common ground with somebody, this is not at all Naphta's strong point. His actual profession is dividing and splitting. So I don't understand fully. Is this search for common ground, is this sort of naive attempt to win over Settembrini, to make him a, a convert, a proselyte of his own ideology? I don't know. But okay, one thing at a time. What is the common ground that Naphta is trying to present here between himself and Settembrini? What they have in common is that both Naphta and Settembrini have an idealized understanding of the past. They both seem to assume that in an ancient past, there had been an original ideal state of humanity, a primal state of statelessness. So in a non of statelessness, of non-violence of human society, where no government nor formal state was needed. And then there's also a common understanding that this ideal state was somehow corrupted. Or, as Naphta puts it in more religious or theological terms, there has been a fall from grace. And now, because of this fall from grace, or as Settembrini would put it, because of that human fallibility, a state power was established, had to be established, and to protect the individual and the society from violence and from injustice. And so to Settembrini, this sounds like the social contract, the contrat social described by the French philosopher Rousseau. So he can somewhat link to that idea, and he can agree up to that point, even if Naphta has probably a different understanding of the sort of social contract that was at work here. So, but this is where the agreement between Settembrini and Naphta ends. From this point on, Settembrini wants a forward development, something linear, a progress driven by reason, a development towards even greater individual freedom and liberty, guided by reason, by the human intellect. Naphta, however, he doesn't want a linear progress towards more freedom and liberty. He wants a violent return to the ideal original state. So again, we have this motif of circularity here. So Settembrini wants a linear development progress, and Naphta wants a circular movement back to the roots, back to the original state, but by force if needed, because it's needed, by violence. So Naphta sees coercion and terror as the only possible path, as the necessary means to achieve this return to the original ideal state. So what he is proposing here is a Christian version of communism, enforced by a totalitarian power, including the dictatorship of the proletariat. So he's using all these communist terms here. So he sees dictatorship as the path to redemption, as the only path to getting back to a sort of heavenly or divine kingdom through the communist terror state as a necessary transition stage. So, and this is really the real climax of this chapter, unmasking Naphta for what he is, a drooling zealot in the service of a totalitarian socio-political system, a system of Christian communism that is ostensibly based on contradictions, but which is ultimately logical in itself, because it idolizes an ideology that really places itself, that places ideology above reason, and that advocates for a brute force implementation of this ideology with utter disregard of individual freedom, of human rights and human values, and any form of individualism. So, and what follows then is a rather harmless finale of this chapter. Hans and Joachim now visit the modest scholarly rooms of Settembrini, quite a contrast to Naphta's rooms. And from Settembrini, they learn a little bit more about the biographical background about Naphta. And I want to explain this background a little bit more now, because I think it is needed to fully understand the, the specific reaction of Hans Castorp. And because when Settembrini mentions that Naphta is a Jesuit, or is at least supported by the Jesuit order, so Hans Castorp seems to be strongly affected by this revelation. And in order to understand the Hans reaction better, we need to understand what the term Jesuit meant at the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century, especially in the German-speaking countries. So I'm sorry, but we need to take a brief look at the history of Germany, and in particularly the history of the Kingdom of Prussia, which later became the dominant force within the German um, uh, the German Reich. So we need to talk about Prussia and its Chancellor Bismarck. Because in these times, the Jesuit order had in Germany, at least in the German-speaking countries, had an extremely bad reputation and a very difficult standing. Jesuit was almost a dirty word, an insult. And this is rooted in what in German history we call the Kulturkampf period. So usually it's translated into English as cultural struggle. So you'll find a Wikipedia article on this, on cultural struggle. It's not to be confused with the term cultural war. We call it in English, it's called cultural struggle, or in German, Kulturkampf. So what was it this all about? In a nutshell, um, at the beginning of the 19th century, in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic War, there emerged a new understanding of the state in Europe. So the states were more self-confident. They were looking for greater independence from church influences in terms of societal, social rules, in terms of the who is going to set the rules for the education system and for state institutions. So governments were becoming more self-confident, were striving for a greater separation between church and state and greater independence from church influence. And this did not go down particularly well with the Catholic Church, and who also didn't appreciate the emphasis that the modern states were putting on ideas like freedom of speech and freedom of opinion and freedom of choice also in religious matters. And so this really triggered a counter movement on the side of the Catholic Church, and in particular under Pope Pius IX. There emerged a movement that was known or labeled as ultramontanism. So literally translated from beyond the mountains. So from the German perspective, so it was people looking at what was set beyond the mountains on the other side of the Alps in Rome. And this ultramontanism, it was a sort of an ecclesiastical Catholic reform movement that tried to restore greater influence for the church at state level and was aiming at the sort of a re-Catholicization, make the world more Catholic again, yeah, at least the European part of the world. And this was not at all not well received by the German or the Prussian government, and the situation worsened when the new dogma of papal infallibility was introduced in 1870. This was again seen by German and Prussian state authority as an attempt to pump up the political influence of the Pope and of the Catholic Church by also manipulating the conscience of Catholic citizens, putting them into a sort of loyalty conflict between their loyalty to the church or the Pope and the government. And so then in some European countries, and particularly in Prussia and in Germany, this led to a series of laws that were intended to curb the influence, in particular, of the Catholic Church. And among these laws, there was the so-called pulpit law, which prohibited clergymen from misusing their clerical office to make political statements from the pulpit in their Sunday sermons. And another important measure was the introduction of civil marriage, so downgrading the importance of the church marriage. And most importantly, in the context of the novel The Magic Mountains, there was a ban of the Jesuit order in Prussia, because the state authorities considered, in particular, the Jesuit order as the main instrument of the church to strengthen its influence in the education system and in the state system. And so this law banned all branches of the Jesuit order on German territory, and it even prohibited Jesuits from residing in Germany, or it entitled German authorities to expel Jesuits from the territory. And this law was in force until 1917. So at the time of the plot of the Magic Mountain, these laws were still in force, so the Jesuit order was still considered an illegal order in Germany whose representatives could be expelled at any time. And this was also, it was not just that this order was banned, also there was really an initiative of public defamation of the order. So really some sort of slander arose, for example, that it was supposedly an official Jesuit rule that the end justified the means, that according to the supposed rules of this order, all means, including all immoral or illegal means, were permitted for the members of this order in order to achieve the order's goals. Of course, this was complete nonsense. There is no such and was no such order in such rule in the Jesuit order. But these were was sort of rumors and spread deliberately by the government in the German society, and this dominated public opinion towards the Jesuits at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century in German-speaking country. And I think against this background, we can better understand Hans' strong reaction to this revelation that Naphta was a Jesuit. So what Hans shows here is a mixture of fascination and horror. On the one hand, he seems strongly affected and repelled, but on the other hand, he seems to be fascinated. Oh, a true Jesuit. We haven't seen that in decades here in Germany. So he wonders, so such discourse does wonders in the way of enlarging the horizon. So it's fascinating and interesting. In other words, there is a fascination of the taboo, of the unknown, of the long forbidden here. And yeah, Settembrini, he has a different point of view on this Jesuit order. He therefore immediately tries to dampen Hans' enthusiasm in a somewhat. He fears that nothing good will come of this contact with this Jesuit. And so he tries to emphasize another aspect of Naphta that he considers negative. He calls him a voluptuary, and this initially causes a misunderstanding because Hans understands this literally, but Settembrini means it in a figurative sense. So Naphta is someone who indulges in the death drive, who cherishes aggression, who has a strong desire to destroy for destruction's sake. So someone who has even a strong inclination to self-destruction. And we have already seen in earlier chapters that Settembrini considers the death drive and the erotic drive to be closely related and equally dangerous. And so this is why he calls Naphta a voluptuary. And because for Settembrini, carnal lust and the death drive, they are just two sides of the same medal. He sees both equally as a weakness of character, as a peril, as a dissoluteness from which he wants to protect Hans. But whether Hans can be protected from this attitude of Naphta, that remains to be seen. When it comes to real carnal lust, to real eroticism, Settembrini has already failed as a mentor because he was unable to protect his pupil Hans Castorp from it. The attraction and the temptation of Claudia Chauchat has been much stronger. We have learned this. But whether he manages to protect Hans from Naphta's death drive, we shall see. So I hope I've been able to explain some of the intricacies of this discussion between Settembrini and Naphta in a way that makes some sense to you. I've tried to give it some structure and to highlight the key topics of this discussion. And so I hope that you will be with me next time when we talk about the next section, the fourth section of the chapter number 6. Until then, have a great reading time. I'm looking forward to your comments. Take care, bye-bye, and ciao.